access, we need policies that support integrated planning and address the power sector as a whole. We need dedicated electrification targets, fiscal and other incentives, exemptions on value-added tax and import duties that focus on the specific renewable energy technologies, that new generation of super-efficient appliances, which the lower class and poor will depend upon. We need to improve the governance and capacity of power utilities and regulators so that they can raise financing for new infrastructure development. And we need quality standards that are enforced for renewable energy equipment in the lighting, cooking, mini-grid areas in particular. So if the first, energy efficiency, second, access, third, we need to get the policy and financing right so that we can allow renewable energy to reach its full potential. Renewables are already helping to transform the global energy mix, slowly to begin with, but faster and faster, driven by technological advance and the slashing of their costs. Figures from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, show that prices for solar voltaic modules have fallen by about 80% since 2009, and for wind turbines by 30 to 40%. We see deals in some parts of the world to supply solar power that are now being done at or below 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Countries are bidding out new supply and seeing all bids won by renewable energy proposals, offering energy more cheaply and without subsidy. Asia has some of the best renewable energy resources in the world, from geothermal to solar to wind to wave to biomass, but policy and finance needs to catch up with the strides made by technology. When renewable energy is in many parts of the world cost competitive with or even cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives, regulatory frameworks in Asia need to adjust to allow this region to benefit from an increasingly cleaner blend. ASEAN countries have set an aspirational target that by 2025, renewables will account for 23% of the region's total primary energy supply, against just over 9% in 2014. That's an ambition level that begins to put the region on the right course. IRENA calculates that this target can be met with average annual investment in renewables of $27 billion, just 1% of ASEAN's GDP, and that this cost would be outweighed by savings from reduced externalities, such as air pollution, impacts from mitigation in climate change, and lower fossil fuel bills. We all know that we need to get energy prices right. We need to continue to make progress in removing harmful fossil fuel subsidies. We need to put a price on carbon. We need to set standards and targets for performances in vehicles, to buildings, to appliances, and we need to creatively manage demand. If we aggressively pursue all of these, then the risk of locking in a carbon-intensive pathway that will become increasingly unaffordable from both a cost and development perspective, as countries face urgent energy generation questions now, diminishes. Countries must create a level playing field for renewables that will encourage more finance to flow. And at the same time, the overall investment climate and creating that business-enabling environment that will allow domestic and international investment to find its place in a modern energy system must be an ever-increasing priority. Those countries that are doing this are being rewarded with access to long-term quality investment in this sector. The recent New Climate Economy report for 2016 noted that sustainable infrastructure would require $90 trillion of investment between now and 2030. That's more than the total worth of the current stock. A significant portion of that is in Asia and is related to energy infrastructure. The international community, to be your partner, must step up with available and appropriate support, coordinated and predictable support to countries that have difficult choices to make, but need to make the choices that will be smarter in the long run. Concessional finance from multilateral development banks, from national development banks and other sources will need to be strategically applied where it can have the greatest catalytic effect. This energy transition, which we are already embarked upon, where we can already see how fast things may move, will have to bring everyone along. We will have to meet everyone's needs, and it will have to drive the economic transition that we have agreed that we are asking for. I leave you with one final thought. The Charter of the United Nations, to which all of us in this room subscribe, is that we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined. And it goes on. Well, last year, we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined that we would build an economy and an energy system underpinning it that would meet everyone's needs as cleanly and as affordably as possible. That we would put the economy back in balance with the planet's chemistry. We, the peoples, is not just the people in this room. We, the peoples, are the women who can't cook a meal for their kids without damaging their kids' lungs. We, the people, are the kids that still can't expect to study in school because it's just too cold to concentrate. We, the peoples, is that small business owner on the outskirts of a fast-growing city that just can't turn the profit that he knows that he could make because the electricity just isn't there predictably or affordably. This is the ultimate challenge for us as a generation and as a community. We, the peoples, is everyone. We have the technology. We have the finance. We know how to do the policy. We have to do all three together with a sense of urgency, which has escaped us up to now. Thank you.
Rachel Kyde, thank you very much, Madame, for those heartfelt words. Thank you indeed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a second keynote address, and this time would be the Chairman, UK Gas and Electricity Markets Authority. Please welcome on stage David Gray.
Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd particularly like to thank Minister Iswaran for inviting me to this very impressive event. I met him in London a couple of years ago and was unable to come last year, but I'm pleased I've been able to make it this year. The theme today is the new energy realities, which is a very good and appropriate theme for a conference such as this at the moment. The energy industry seems to me to be changing faster now than at any time I can remember, and I've been involved in the sector in one form or another since 1973. Things that seemed like an interesting, if rather distant, possibility a few years ago are becoming the new reality quickly. But I think it's important to recognize and understand that there are two types of change here. One is new and is driving us towards these new realities. It's the increasing importance and impact of innovation and new technology in the energy sector. The other is not new. It's a continuing feature of energy markets, but it becomes more important as a driving force the more that markets are liberalized. And this second factor is the intrinsic volatility of primary energy prices. Of course, even in a period of rapid change, there are some future trends that can be seen with at least a degree of confidence. In particular, governments around the world now have quantified targets to cut greenhouse gases. Most governments have quantified objectives for security of supply in energy. These provide a framework for thinking about the future, but they don't necessarily tell us the eventual destination, or in particular, how we'll get there. So this morning, I'd like to talk about volatility in primary energy prices, the new developments that are beginning to shape the energy supply business, and the implications of those things for regulation of energy markets. So I started my career in 1973 as an investment analyst in the oil and gas sector, and for 20 years I was faced with having to forecast oil prices. And I learned a lot from that experience. Most obviously, that forecasting oil prices is a very hard thing to do. Just to give you the picture, since I started to work in this area, oil prices doubled in 1973 as soon as I first looked at the market, then doubled again in 1979, then fell by half during the early 1980s, then fell precipitously in 1986. They then recovered a bit and rose from about $20 a barrel to well over $100 between 2004 and 2008, before falling back to $40 in 2009, rising to $100 in 2014, back to $30 at the beginning of this year, and about $50 today. I mention this just to give you the long-term picture. I think some people may correctly be able to claim to forecast some of those changes, at least in principle, but most will, if they're honest, admit to having been consistently taken by surprise. That's certainly happened to me often enough. The reason for this is that the crude oil market in particular is intrinsically unstable. Supply and demand both tend to be difficult to forecast on any sort of timescale, and the net balance moves from deficit to surplus and back again surprisingly quickly. OPEC has been intermittently effective as a cartel, but certainly hasn't produced stability. So even in periods when prices look relatively stable, they're often simply in a position of unstable equilibrium, ready to double or half once that equilibrium is broken. And this feeds through to other energy prices. International gas prices tend to have some degree of oil price linkage. But equally, some gas markets can move quite independently. And a good example has been the emergence of large-scale production of shale gas in the United States in recent years, which has had quite a significant impact on international traded markets in both gas and coal. Now, all of this, I know, makes life quite difficult for forecasters, and even more so for those making investment decisions or setting policy. But I don't expect price volatility to go away. It's a consistent feature of the energy world that I've seen. Let me turn now to innovation and new technology. I became involved with energy utilities in the late 1980s with the privatizations of the gas and electricity sectors in the UK. And I think ever since then, people have been telling me that the world would change sometime soon. Large-scale energy storage would become economic. Renewable generation would become competitive with conventional generation. Small-scale modular nuclear generation would replace large-scale nuclear. Small-scale distribution-connected generation would transform the role of electricity distribution networks. Energy efficiency, which Rachel mentioned, would transform the supply and demand balance. And most recently, of course, the digital revolution would transform the industry in the same way as it has transformed many others. And for a long time, I was quite skeptical about this. Yes, things would change, but the timescale might be quite slow. And for a long time, it was. In the UK, we made some significant progress with deployment of wind generation, but progress with the rest of the list I mentioned was really quite slow. But in recent years, it's become clear that things are moving much more quickly and unpredictably. So, for instance, costs of renewable energy, particularly solar, have come down rapidly. And just in the last few months, we've seen some really remarkable developments. We saw solar power in Chile priced at £25 a megawatt hour in August. And this was quickly overtaken by a price of £17 a megawatt hour in Dubai in September. Offshore wind in Denmark was priced at just over £50 a megawatt hour in September, which may seem high compared with those other figures I mentioned, but is well below the level of offshore wind in the North Sea, Northwest Europe in general. Deployment of renewable generation has accelerated rapidly, encouraged by the availability of subsidies and by some dramatic falls in production costs. In the UK, just 4 years ago, when we were establishing the framework for a round of electricity distribution price controls, we used forecasts that had been produced by the UK government that showed deployment of solar generation reaching between 1.5 gigawatts and 3 gigawatts by 2023, which was the end of the period we were looking at. In practice, we've reached 10 gigawatts this year, and that figure is still rising rapidly. And all of that in a country which, frankly, is not noted for its sunshine. Battery storage costs have been coming down rapidly by about 15 or 16% per annum for the last 5 years. The forecasts I've seen seem to assume that rate of decline will level out But I wouldn't be surprised if we're taken by surprise by the pace of deployment of storage capacity in the same way as we've been surprised in the UK by solar. Battery storage, of course, costs, of course, are also directly relevant to the future of electric vehicles, which have begun to be seen on the roads in significant numbers. There tend to be obvious infrastructure constraints in the supply of charging points, but again, I wouldn't be surprised to see electric vehicles beginning to have a significant impact on the electricity system really quite soon. Energy efficiency was mentioned by Rachel, and has been one of the areas of constant frustration, I find, to people in the industry. It always seems an obvious and easy thing to push for. In practice, it's quite hard to have a big impact. But actually, measures that governments have been applying for some years are now beginning to see some real force. In the UK, we have measures to improve insulation of the existing housing stock and to enforce strict energy and carbon standards on new housing. And it's beginning to have a real impact. There's also been a price response, of course, so it's difficult to tell exactly what's going on, but you can see the outcome of this in the path of electricity and gas demand in the UK, which have both fallen by more than 10% in the last few years, compared with the forecasts I used to see, which showed energy demand rising relentlessly into the future. All of this has significant implications for the electricity distribution networks. Such networks were generally designed as passive systems, with power simply flowing down through the voltage networks to the end consumer. But large-scale deployment of distribution-connected generation, normally renewable, is changing all of that. So, for instance, I mentioned those remarkable figures for deployment of solar power in the UK. Not surprisingly, most of this has been in the south of the country, because that's where the sun tends to shine more. And a major part of it has been in the southwest, to the extent that the southwest region of England now has more solar generation capacity than local peak demand, which is something we just didn't see coming. The system, of course, wasn't designed to cope with that. And the answer isn't just to spend lots of money building new wires. So the local distribution company is having to develop a system operation capability and enter into commercial arrangements with generators to allow them to limit output in low demand periods, and also to encourage storage to assist with using the maximum potential available. And that's just a very specific example of what's becoming a widespread trend, which is the development of active or intelligent distribution networks with sophisticated system operation and system balancing roles. I mentioned the digital revolution, which has completely transformed some sectors, but for a long time seemed to have little impact on energy utilities. But that's beginning to change too. The Internet of Things is opening up a whole world of new possibilities for proactive energy demand management. Again, in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in other established markets, we have some large-scale infrastructure constraints that need to be dealt with. But the widespread installation of smart meters and the related move to half-hourly settlement for all consumers could really transform the way we use electricity and have a real impact on that demand-side efficiency. So what are the implications of all of this for regulators? Well, I think they're quite profound, really. Regulatory systems tend to match the design of the industry they were set up to regulate. And in the UK, the system was designed for a world of large-scale central generation, sophisticated national transmission system, simple but unsophisticated local distribution networks, and retail competition between a relatively small number of large-scale supply businesses. And all of that is now changing. The potential scope and impact of these changes means that we can protect the interests of consumers much more effectively through a flexible approach that relies on learning over the years. Flexibility and learning are two of the key strengths of market-based solutions. But the inherent complexity of energy markets means that the market rules also tend to be complex. So there's a real risk that the regulatory framework itself acts as a barrier to innovation and to new business models. So to avoid that, as regulators, we need to encourage technical innovation by ensuring a level playing field on which the benefits can be demonstrated. We need to allow new business models to get established and to flourish, while moving quickly to, if necessary, to present unacceptable risks to consumers, which is our primary role. We need to encourage the monopoly networks to embrace innovation in the way they design and operate their systems, and respond quickly to the changing needs of new network users. And in the UK, we at Ofgem have introduced various forms of innovation funding, paid for by energy consumers, of course, to promote the development of these new approaches, particularly smart grid approaches. And of course, while doing all of these things, we need to provide a stable and predictable framework to give people the confidence to make long-term investments in a changing sector. Now that, as you can imagine, is not an easy balance to achieve, but it's essential if we want consumers to benefit fully from the new realities we're seeing in the energy world. We also need to do some long-term thinking. For instance, the UK's decarbonisation targets effectively require the decarbonisation of heat by 2050. That clearly has some implications for a lot of things, including in particular the future of the gas networks, as well as for regulation of large-scale heat networks. People are already beginning to work towards potential new uses for gas distribution infrastructure, such as hydrogen networks in cities. Large-scale deployment of electric vehicles will increase demand for electricity and substantially change the patterns of demand and the use of networks. That may be a particularly relevant issue here in Singapore, I imagine, with the potential here to adopt a smart city approach with transport and energy policy being integrated to achieve best results. All of these are big challenges for policymakers and for regulators, and they require us to think hard about the future. But you'll probably have recognized from my opening remarks, I think it's dangerous to believe we can make long-term forecasts for the future, and even more dangerous to formulate a single large-scale plan based on that kind of forecast. If you go back to my early days looking at the oil industry, until the early 1980s, companies used to base their large-scale investment decisions on a single central oil price forecast, and it always just went steadily upwards. The oil price volatility of the 1970s and 80s soon put a stop to that. The industry moved to scenario planning. There'd still be a central forecast or a range of forecasts, but the important thing was plans needed to be much more robust to a wider range of potential outcomes or scenarios. And we still use this approach for electricity supply and demand forecasting in the UK. But I'm not sure that even this goes far enough. I think in many ways we simply just need to accept that we don't know what's going to happen, probably even in the short and medium term, never mind out over a period of decades. In our engagement with stakeholders in the UK, despite this, we hear a consistent call for government and the regulator to decide now on the preferred route to the future and to tell stakeholders what's going to happen. And I think that's simply not realistic in a changing world. It would almost inevitably lead to higher bills, higher costs for consumers than necessary, and disruptive step changes later when we inevitably realize we've got something wrong and have to move away from the planned route. But equally, there's clear value in setting a direction of travel and potentially in making some large investments along the way to generate from research and from learning experience. So my conclusions are quite simple to state, but rather more challenging and difficult to put into practice. Policy needs to have clear objectives, but be flexible in implementation. Regulation needs to set out clear principles so that people know how we'll respond. And it needs to provide the predictability to encourage investment. But it also needs to be flexible and vigilant in making sure that in practice, it isn't simply closing off new ideas and blocking new approaches from the market. If we can achieve this balance, we can help to achieve the best outcome for consumers from the new energy realities. And I look forward to discussing these issues with you during the rest of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We invite you to take your seat right here, David, if you will, as we will now, ladies and gentlemen, proceed with the Q&A session. And again, we've been told that There are several questions through the Pigeonhole Live platform already. For that, we thank you, and of course, do keep them coming. We have our moderator for this session. He is the anchor correspondent from CNBC, Sri Jagaraja. Let's welcome him with a round of applause, shall we? And we'll also like to invite Rachel Kai to join us back up at the stage as well. Welcome back. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to hand over the floor to Sri very shortly. Again, we'd like to invite you to enjoy this session of the Q&A, and thereafter the program will move on. Sri, as you're ready, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction. We do have a number of questions, as our host said, on Pigeonhole, so I'm just going to crack on with them and put them to our panelists here. Let's just pick up on where David left off on the policy challenges, David. And one of the most popular questions here on Pigeonhole has been, please elaborate on the policies for green energy usage in Singapore. Now, I know this isn't really your wheelhouse, but it does speak to a broader challenge. Rachel was talking about this, the policy signals you were raising that they need a very deft touch, they need a fine balance. We've seen the smart city model over here integrating energy and transport. Can we really learn any lessons from the Singapore context, and can it be scaled up?
I really liked the Minister's concept of Singapore as a testbed for things. I think that is important. I mentioned in my remarks the importance of governments, despite the uncertainty I see, placing some bets, I suppose, in financing for new research and development. And I think Singapore is well placed to do various aspects of that. It's a reasonably well-defined problem in comparison with some bigger and more complex countries. The primary energy supply is well-defined. It's in the form of natural gas. There's scope for solar. There's certainly scope for innovation in smart demand management, smart management of city operations, and so on. I could see Singapore being a leading player in the development of these things, and those being scalable to other countries in the world.
Okay, Rachel, let me bring you in here. Where does industry stand? And when I refer to industry, not just the fossil fuels industry, oil, gas, and coal, but also what are perceived to be some of the fairly heavy polluting industries. There's a question on Pigeonhole about aviation and the shipping sectors and their role in terms of contributing to bringing greenhouse gas emissions down and contributing to the overall Paris Agreement. What role can they play?
So it's a good question. So each part of the economy is going to have to sort of move along, iteratively, as David said, in the way he talked about regulation. So one thing is to clean the energy system and make that more productive, and then the relationship to the transport sector in particular is absolutely fundamental, and then industry as well. I think that there's real momentum within heavy industry and across different sectors of industry in terms of understanding, despite low energy prices or low oil prices, the need to get ahead of the curve in terms of energy productivity, not only for their own business but down their supply chain. A number of leading companies, and many of them in Asia, have signed something called EP100, which is a counterbalance to a commitment to purchase only 100% renewables, but to double energy productivity as a result. And that's cement companies and manufacturing, Tata Motors, etc., all coming into that. I think the ICAO agreement, the recent agreement on, or the agreement that's being hashed out for the airline industry, is an important step. I think it's an imperfect agreement, but what we're seeing is that we're stepping forward and then trying to ratchet up as we learn how to do better. And the shipping industry is somewhere behind. That's key for Singapore. But I think there is some really important innovation going on in terms of the efficiency with which we move cargo at sea, everything from ship design to the fuels that they use. And that's a sector that's going to have to, I think, drive forward in the future.
There's been a fair degree of pushback, though, especially from the aviation industry, who already see themselves burdened with costs and growing costs and more bills, and the emissions targets implies more costs on top of that. How do you reconcile those pressures within the industry to cutting greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I think there's two things, and this is actually something for industry to think about going forward. You know, we know where we're going, right? We're going to this point on the horizon in mid-century, and we're all in that. There's no scenario where half the boat goes up and half the boat doesn't, right? We all are in the same boat. So the amount of energy that companies spent on advocating against a progressive agreement, while at the same time spending R&D on trying to be competitive under that new agreement, is something that C-suites and boards have to determine. But there are a number of airline companies in very, very advanced research around biofuels. There are a number of collaborative efforts, and some of these will be being launched in the next few months, around really working through some of the bioenergy issues for fuel. And, you know, many of the major airlines have been the leading investors in those technologies. So, you know, on the one hand, you know, I think to the industry people in the room, it's going to be voluntary or it's going to be mandatory. Whether it's disclosure of risk, or whether it's standards, or whether it's the way in which each sector of the economy is pushed forward to greater and greater achievement. You all like voluntary better than you like mandatory. Therefore, work hard to have really far-reaching voluntary agreements, because otherwise, I think societal pressure for mandatory will just grow.
And David, in your experience as a regulator, and I know that we're in very, very early days here, and this is evolving technology when we talk about renewables, but it does have longer-term implications for the legacy oil and gas industry. It has implications for coal mining as well. How do you sell this story to them? Because my understanding is that the transition, if it's not managed properly, if it is disorderly, could mean job losses, it could mean stranded assets, and it could potentially mean a deep financial stress, possibly even financial crisis.
I think that's the negative way to look at it. I think markets are markets, and they do unpredictable things, and people do well or do badly depending on how they're placed in that setup. Governments around the world have moved towards markets for energy. They have great advantage in promoting innovation and in promoting new business models. And there is damage along the way. You see it in some of the mainstream European energy utilities, which have gone from being, you know, the big, powerful players in the sector 10 years ago to now being much smaller and faced with widespread competition. I think one of the things you have to accept if you think the world is changing and the decarbonisation goals are really an attempt to change things on a large scale, is that there will be winners and losers along the way. And you can't plan to avoid disruption. What you have to do is think about how to cope with disruption and to minimize its effects on people. Yeah. But you can't avoid it.
Do you think that the industry gets it, though? I mean, let me put it really bluntly here. I mean, can we divide the fossil fuels industry into two camps? The deniers. You and I were talking about this, Rachel, and they are in a distinct minority, and those who really see the writing on the wall and who are reconfiguring the broader business model towards carbon neutrality when it comes in 2050, which is the plan for Paris.
Well, there are, within the coal industry, there are different players who have a slightly different view on what the survival of their business model is going forward, and you could characterize some as being in denial and some as not, but I think they're sophisticated people on their boards and in their management, and I think they know what the future is. The question is, where do they compete going forward? Within the oil sector, again, there are companies with different degrees of bullishness about what the future business model is for oil companies, and within the gas sector, the gas companies have different views as well. But I think what's happening is, you know, fairly stringent processes of review around what options are and where the technology and the capacity of these companies can be best used going forward if we are moving towards decarbonisation. So we decarbonise either by putting less of the stuff in the atmosphere, or by putting it up and pulling it down immediately, or by the way we use land systems. So you know, you can see companies trying to work out where they are in that space. But I think there's going to be extraordinary pressure on transparency. I mean, you talked about stranded assets. I think the pressure on stranded assets is not going to be so much an intellectual debate about whether or not we have a carbon bubble. What I do think is that for shareholders and for investors, understanding that the management and board of the company really is thinking through in a very sophisticated way what the risks and opportunities are from carbon intensity going forward, that's going to demand transparency. And the Bloomberg Commission that will report out at the end of this year, the work of the FSB, the People's Bank of China working with the Bank of England on understanding these trends, there's going to be more and more disclosure requirements. And that, if that isn't a sort of focusing momentum for boards and management of fossil fuel companies, then I don't know what is.
And David, would you agree that natural gas remains the de facto transition fuel that's going to bridge the divide between carbon intensity and carbon neutrality? Is that the way you see it?
Yes, I think it does. It has the advantage of being more efficient, less carbon emitting, readily available, and is clearly going to have a major role to play for quite a long time. When I mentioned decarbonisation targets in the UK to 2050, that is a long way away in terms of most people's business horizon. But on the other hand, we're already making investment decisions that go out beyond that. So we need to start thinking about this. But I see natural gas as being very much in the fuel mix for some considerable time.
Talk to me about the conversations that you are having about pricing mechanisms and the pricing regime, because Rachel made it very clear that innovation is really bringing down renewables on the cost curve. They are far more competitive now, more competitive than they have ever been. Does that necessarily imply, though, that you and I as consumers are going to pay less for our electricity, or does it imply a broader shake-up of the entire system to take account for renewables and the role they are playing?
When you ask the question, will you pay less, you've got to say, in comparison with what? And that's quite difficult to judge sometimes at the moment. I think that there's a tendency for people either to look at the short-term costs of renewables and worry about subsidies to expensive industries, or equally to look at long-term costs of remaining with conventional generation and fossil fuel sources. And it's all probably a bit too simplistic. I think I'd echo Rachel's point about transparency. I think the best thing governments can do is be open about what they're doing. I think people accept that there are costs involved in a transition, but while you're going through that transition, you can also show examples of how things are working. The deployment of solar that I mentioned in the UK is driven by some large-scale subsidies. But 5 years ago, we were worrying about whether those subsidies were just ridiculously big. What they did was generate a solar industry, similar subsidies around the world, not just the UK, which has brought the costs of solar generation right down to being competitive. And there's a real benefit to consumers. It does give governments a bit of a problem in matching the level of subsidy to the level of production costs.
So what you're saying is that the pendulum has swung in the direction of promoting renewables from a subsidy point of view. It begs the question, at what point do governments dial back on those subsidies, because it is distorting the market to a certain extent, yeah?
Well, you see that already in the UK. The government is drawing back from the more expensive subsidies, which frankly aren't required anymore. The art, I think, is to be honest with people who are investing. You either lock in the terms for projects at the time that they invest, or you don't, and you say there's a risk. Both methods are viable. What you can't do, though, is appear to do both at once.
Okay, let's bring it back to the post-COP21 environment. And you and I were talking about this, Rachel. There's just been enormous momentum in terms of the ratification process. We've now crossed that implementation line. November the 4th, the Paris deal enters into force. There's a question related to that. Looking at the developing or biggest manufacturing countries like India and China, what are the possible policy options for them to ensure energy sustainability? And I guess this goes back down to the question of NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, and whether in a COP21 environment now, emerging markets like India and China can hit them and deliver.
So I think that both China and India have got long-term visions and medium-term targets. right, which is a lot more than can be said for many other economies. And so, you know, that's the important, that's working out how you think you can manage all of these variables and then do it in an iterative way, as David was talking about. This requires a total government approach. It requires management across, because you're going to have different priorities within government, but you've got to know where you're driving yourself to. So I think that the challenge is to help every country be in a situation